All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast, and continuing on with the series, Managing in the Midst of the Current Epidemic. We're very excited to have back my guest, Dr. Thema Bryant-Davis. Thema, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be with you.
All right. So Dr. Thema Bryant-Davis is a licensed psychologist, ordained minister, and sacred artist who has worked nationally and globally to provide relief and empowerment to marginalized persons. Dr. Thema, a professor at Pepperdine University, is a past president of the Society for the Psychology of Women. Her contributions to psychological research, policy, and practice have been honored by national and regional psychological associations. Dr. Thema earned her doctorate from Duke University, completed her postdoctoral training at Harvard Medical Center, and is a past American Psychological Association representative to the United Nations. All right. So, first of all, how are you doing given everything that's going on?
I am holding up, but it is a lot of multitasking. And so I am holding up, but spending a lot of time in this chair because all of my clients have moved to teletherapy, and I teach at Pepperdine, and all of our classes are now online. So managing that as well as parenting. So it's a juggling act, but a stationary juggling act. So it's been quite interesting.
Yeah. So let me start with the question in terms of how are you perceiving this in terms of a macro level, even a global level, and then let's kind of drill down to the individual level. But Thema, what are you seeing that's going on?
Yes. So this is what I am seeing is a global trauma in the sense of this big pandemic that we are going through simultaneously, not only nationally, but as you've named, globally. There is the medical aspect, but there is also the trauma that we are seeing in terms of the disconnection from agencies or institutions or governments that many people would usually rely on for some sense of safety, security, or a plan. And so there is a lot of distrust. And a part of that is just dealing with the unknown because, this is something we have never experienced before. And so some of the information changes over time as people are trying to get the information. So we have the medical trauma, the collective trauma, the issues around political distrust. And then we also are seeing highlighted the health disparities around race and income. And so there are layers that are happening, and you have the realities of some people living in denial. And I know the impact of when you are facing a trauma that other people don't acknowledge. Not only is that medically concerning, but psychologically concerning. So for those who are losing loved ones literally to this pandemic and having to hear other people say it's not real and this isn't really happening, so that can be very disorienting and frustrating.
So a plethora of issues that are going on here. And listening to you list them all, it's what? It's frightening. It's immobilizing. The idea that we've got obviously medical trauma going on and a collective global trauma, distrust in everything. How, as you see it, how are people dealing with it, not dealing with it, adapting to it? You talked about people, a certain section of people, certainly in denial.
You see a range of responses that we see with other types of trauma, but it's heightened in this circumstance. And so some people are dealing with depression and despair. And some of those people had pre-existing depression, and now this has intensified it. And for some people, it's depression for the first time. And being aware of the challenges with lost time, lost opportunity, and when people don't see an end in sight. I was talking with a client this week, and she was saying she really had a breakdown because she had in her mind that this was going to end this month. And then someone told her it may go until the rest of the year. And she was immobilized by that. So that becomes a piece too, if you have in your mind, okay, if I can just hold on for this many more days or this many more weeks. So the powerlessness and frustration. Some people are dealing with anxiety. It's interesting. Someone with OCD was sharing how triggering it is to see everybody else doing behaviors that previously were considered a problem, that they have been trying to cut down on the number of wiping and washing and vigilance. And now when that is the rule and the mandate and them seeing everyone else do it, it becomes challenging of like, how much is too much? People, have posted videos of themselves like washing down their groceries and showing how like the first week they were very detailed, and maybe as the weeks go by, being less careful, but is that okay? Another piece that we're seeing is grief and mourning. And because of the hot pockets or, hot zones, there are some people who have had many losses. So just like in some areas of the country, people will say, I don't know anyone who's been affected. And then you talk to other people and it's been multiple family members and friends and church members. So that grief, and I should say along with the grief, one of the challenges has been them not being able to attend funerals, either it not being safe to travel, or most places now the funerals are limited to 10 people. And so then you have the conflict in family of who gets to go and who gets to decide who gets to go. And people feeling, what do I do with this grief that before it wasn't fixed by a funeral, but there was a sense of coming together and support and storytelling. Some people showing symptoms of post-traumatic stress, but I also like to remind people we are not post-trauma, right? So we're talking about ongoing trauma. So it's not even how do we recover. Right now we're still in coping. How do we cope with an ongoing pandemic? Another piece I see heightened is addiction. And so it was interesting when they were deciding what were going to be essential businesses, and one of the essential businesses is the liquor store. And when I mentioned that to some people, they're like, they better keep the liquor store open, right? Like, we need that. It's like looking for an outlet. And when you can't go anywhere, and then if your AA or NA groups are no longer meeting or not meeting in person, that becomes a challenge. An interesting one I do want to mention is the increase of domestic violence. And all of the hotlines, not just in the US, but in other countries, are reporting an increase in calls. And so, what it means to be quarantined with someone who is not safe. And then the other end of the spectrum are the clients I'm working with who are single, who are quarantined alone, and who talk about, feeling the end of the world is coming and I don't have anybody. And so while some people see it as an opportunity for online dating and that kind of thing, some people are engaging in risky behaviors of still going out and meeting people or going to people's homes because they are lonely and wanting companionship. And so that becomes a dynamic as well.
Well, in terms of how marginalized peoples have been disproportionately, negatively impacted by this. Yes. Talk about that.
Yeah. So there have been really high rates with African Americans, with Latinos, and with Native Americans. And there are multiple factors that contribute to that. Some of the reasons are we are more likely to be, and for those who don't see me, who are listening to the audio, I'm African American. So we are more likely to be essential workers and hourly wage workers, meaning if I don't go to work, if I don't get some hours, I do not get paid, and then we do not eat. Because it's interesting, while we were getting grace with mortgages, and I'm blessed to be in that number, relief was not coming systematically around rent, right? And so people then needing to go, if they weren't already working at the supermarket or working at the gas station, needing those positions in order to provide for their families. And so a part of it is linked to being lower socioeconomic status. Another piece of it is having higher rates of conditions that result in you being immune compromised. And so increased risk of diabetes, obesity, increased risk of HIV and AIDS. And so all of those illnesses create greater risk. Even asthma is related to race. And when we talk about environmental racism, I have recently become involved with my neighborhood council and seeing that when people are in high income areas, they are able to organize to block high pollutant companies from being built in their neighborhoods. And so then where do they get built? In low income areas. Right. And so just the toxins in the air. There have also been some studies connecting trauma with asthma. And so when we talk about the respiratory part of the pandemic, there's increased risk. And then there is actual bias, and there have been multiple studies done with medical professionals having racial bias. And so when you say, who gets to determine whether or not you get a test? Who gets to determine whether or not you get a bed? And disproportionately, African Americans by medical personnel are deemed to be, they are interpreted as faking pain. So they assume people are just trying to get medication for pain because of addiction instead of actually being in pain or distress. And so when you have that going into it, there have been multiple cases of people who were people of color who go to the hospital and were sent home. And by the time they were admitted, it was too late. So all of these factors contribute to the increased risk. One more I should mention is us being more likely to live in high density areas. So if you're in a rural area, more spread out, there's kind of natural social distancing. If you're living in an urban area with, high-rise apartments or low-income housing, there are a lot of people in a small place. So even if you say we're going to social distance or we're going to quarantine, how do you do that if there are multiple people living in a small area? And I should also mention, because I didn't mention Asian Americans, the increase of Asian American focused racism in the midst of this pandemic, where people, Asian Americans, some had already experienced racism, but some who had not are, experiencing that hatred of, you are the carriers, go back where you came from. And so there is so much that we need to address as trauma psychologists.
Jeez. I mean, it's a lot. So obviously this pandemic has almost, if not ignited, definitely shone the light on all of these elements that you're talking about here. I mean, I feel almost naive in saying this and asking this question, but what do you do? What can we do? What do you do? How?
Yes. It is a lot. And so a part of the mandate for me has been not limiting myself to individual psychotherapy. I will say, that my practice is full, and like people who had terminated a long time ago have all come back, right? Because everyone is overwhelmed. And so, people are reaching out, and that individual support is important, and I'm providing it. But the need is so great. That's why we need platforms like yours and what you are doing in terms of getting the information, disseminating the information beyond, I would say, the academy, because I work in the academy, but I would say even beyond the treatment office. So there is a movement, an orientation called decolonized psychology, right? And decolonizing psychology is about recognizing the systems and structures that are at play that Western psychology often presents it as if the only thing that matters is the person in the room. And if I can just shift your cognition, then everything else will be fine. But to decolonize psychology is to recognize we are living in a society where there are all of these factors at play, and for us to remove the myth that healing can only happen in 50-minute increments where there is insurance payments involved, and where like your family can't come, and where there's no food, and like all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say for each mental health professional to think about not only how do I serve my clients and ask about and address the nuances and the layers, but to think about one way in which you can bring the information of psychology beyond your office. So that may be writing an editorial for the newspaper. That could be through a podcast, a webinar, a YouTube video, a blog. It may be even, I'll say, I'm a part of the local church. And so the pastor asked me to do a Zoom meeting about how to cope, right? What are some coping strategies? So, you know, there are many members of the church who for around race, culture, religion, SES have a stigma or barrier to seeking services. And so getting the information to them. And yes, you know, a workshop is not the same thing as therapy, but giving people some important nuggets about how they can cope. And also, you know, what I always start with is us having compassion for ourselves and for others, because everybody is going through it and they're going through it differently. They're responding differently. And so highlighting that perhaps the family member who didn't call you back is not just selfish or mean, maybe they're overwhelmed, right? And so getting the information beyond us is important. And then I would also say for those who are writers, researchers, or even voters, to think about the policy implications of what we know, right? Because, you know, when I talk about these structural pieces of who gets a test or addressing medical bias, like all of these things are shaped by policy. And so, you know, sometimes we'll say, I don't want to be political, I just want to help people. But in order to help people, the information that you have can help us create policies that will reach more people. So I would think, and there's no hierarchy, I believe, on the way that we can make an impact or difference. So you just think about what works for you, like what aligns with either your personality or your skill set. But to just say, in addition to serving my clients, how can I make a larger contribution?
To think that, you know, this pandemic has really elucidated or illuminated and impacted the African American population so much more severely than other populations is scary, is maddening. How do you, as an African American woman, as a psychologist, as someone with a very powerful and strong voice, what is going through your being as you're going through this?
It is, so W.E.B. Du Bois, who was an African American great scholar, thinker, activist, change agent, he wrote about something called double consciousness. And with double consciousness, it is African Americans' ability to both see things through their own lens and see things through the lens of, you would either say white America, mainstream America, however you want to name that. But in order to function, really having an awareness of both worlds. So, it isn't even something that you consciously do. It is for really a survival strategy that you, in some ways, have to be able to do that. So just by way of example, when the mandate went out for the mask, you know, as a psychologist and someone who wants to, you know, as a mother, all these things. I'm like, and my son has asthma. So I'm like, yes, we need to wear these masks. It's very important. And simultaneously, I am very much aware of it even before it happened, that this was going to be an issue for Black men walking around with masks. That, because of the profiling, because of the pathologizing, the criminalizing, that when you have Black men, and it happens as well to Black women, walking around masked, even without the mask and without a weapon, they're already considered a danger, a threat.
Mm-hmm.
If a Black man just walks into a building, people are like, what's he doing? So then you put on top of that, having the mask on. So, right. So then they're, really in a bind of like, I want to live. And also, so we've seen issues on both sides in the sense of when they wear the mask, they have shared already their experience of walking into a store with a mask on and having the store security come over to them and ask them like what they're doing. And they're like, I'm here to buy juice. Right? So they're already under surveillance or assumed to be up to no good. The other side of that is if they don't wear the mask, the footage was released about them being beaten down by the police for not practicing social distancing. So this video was put up to show the difference of in this white area, people weren't social distancing and the police were walking around handing out masks and telling them, you guys be safe, be careful, officer friendly, who you learn about growing up. And then you see this other footage in a Black neighborhood where people are, tired of sitting in the house. They're sitting out on their steps, not doing anything, just sitting with each other. And it became this whole body slamming young people and saying it was because they weren't practicing social distancing. And so I carry all of that with me as we're trying to figure out solutions. Is solutions for who? It's just like when we say evidence-based treatment. Evidence based on, right? Evidence based on who? And then what do these solutions mean for this group of people? I do also just want to mention, because I'm a part of faith community, and this has become this big debate in the very recently with the president saying, churches need to meet immediately and they have the right to meet, and these, governors can't stop them from meeting. And, as a member of a church and a predominantly Black church, knowing that we are disproportionately being affected, most of the people in my community are like, please, no, do not gather all these people together. And it does, I think he was touching on a sore spot, because some communities of faith or faith leaders felt upset about not being called essential workers because the work they do as chaplains and the way they serve people. And they were saying, how come, a liquor store is essential and we're not? So I get that. And at the same time, we need to meet online, or some people are meeting by conference call so that people can be safe.
No. In terms of, if we were to look at individually how people can cope, you talked about some coping strategies. Let's talk a little bit about that, and then let's also kind of segue into some suggestions for the therapists who are going to be listening here. So what are your thoughts on coping strategies, how people can manage through this?
So a couple of pointers. One is, I recommend people reduce or limit their exposure to the news. And, and I say that from the standpoint of someone who really values being informed. And I do believe we should be informed. So it's not the kind of thing of there are bad things in the world I don't want to know. But we live in the era of the 24-hour news cycle, and often they do not have new information. So there's the information of the day, and then there's hours of commentary. So the commentary you don't really need. It's just people sharing their hypothetical thoughts, right, of what might happen. So I would just say deciding how you're going to obtain your news and setting an amount of time a day, but not having that death count as your background theme song of your day. The other thing that happens with that is often people have children in the house. So kids are hearing that and trying to make sense of it. So be informed, but limit your exposure to that information. The next thing I would say is the importance of social support. And so, the phrase people have been using is physically distancing, but socially connected, right? So using these platforms, using the phone, dropping off if you can, or sending delivery for neighbors or for our elders, so that there is a sense of needing to push through the isolation. And along those lines, I would really encourage people to know there's no shame in loneliness, right? That some people are feeling very lonely, and it is, that's a healthy response of, it just means I want more connection in my life than I currently have. And some people are quarantined with people and still feeling lonely. So to seek out those supports, and I would say the supports where it's reciprocal or mutual, because some of us have large networks, but if you're the strong one in your family or the strong one on your job, then everyone is looking to you to pour. But it's important to have some relationships that pour back into you, where you can be transparent and receive that. So social support is important. And an important thing we know with trauma is structure or routine is helpful, especially because we are in a situation where we don't know what it's going to look like or for how long. So I know when we were first, told to shelter in place, that some parents were going into don't put pressure on the kids, let them do whatever they want. And if this was a couple days, I get it. But now we're talking about over a month. And so I would say, especially for young people, bedtime is still good. Having some routine to the day, whether that's sometime with their schoolwork or sometime exercise or when the meal times are, because when we lose any sense of schedule, it really makes it more likely for us to fall into that pit of depression. Another one is the exercise and monitoring what we eat. There's that phrase, our food affects our mood. And so, yes, a lot of us are doing emotional eating, or people were joking saying, I ate all my quarantine snacks in the first 2 days. So, we give ourselves grace, but at the same time, trying to make sure, we're nourishing ourselves, drinking water, exercise. A big piece in trauma now is embodied healing or embodied psychology. And so many of us are holding the stress in our bodies. And so that muscle tension, migraines, nausea. So eating right and exercise is important. The last one I'll mention last two, expressive arts. The arts are a wonderful way of releasing that stress. And not only for children, we usually think of arts for kids, but for adults as well. Journaling, therapy, and spiritual practices. So and one simple one is around gratitude, a gratitude journal. Is there anything that I can think of that I'm grateful about today?
Yeah. Wow. I mean, you're not just a wealth of information, but a wealth of inspiration too. Listening to you. I really mean it. I love talking to you. And I think it's important to get you back here more often and more frequently. So before we go here, how can people best get in contact with you?
Yes. So my website is Dr. Thema, DrThema.com. And I want to tell therapists it's especially important that we practice self-care. And I will recommend this book, The Self-Care Prescription by Robin Gobin. She's a psychologist, and it's important as we're trying to take care of so many and facilitate their process that we not lose sight of ourselves. So I'm also on Twitter and Instagram, and I have a podcast as well called The Homecoming Podcast, which you can find on iTunes, YouTube, Spotify, and SoundCloud.
Oh, nice. How long have you been doing that?
Since July.
Wow.
Yes.
Very cool. Well, I'll have all that linked up here at the show notes page.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank you
Amy,
so
man.
much.
I love having you on here, and I'm going to have you back.
Oh, I would love it. I love the conversation and appreciate what you're doing.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.